All right, hello everyone and welcome back. I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker of the conference, keynote presenter Matthew Ratcliffe, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of York in the UK. Dr. Ratcliffe is the author of 5 books: Rethinking Common Sense Psychology from 2007, Feelings of Being, Phenomenology, Psychiatry, and the Sense of Reality from 2008, Experiences of Depression, a Study in Phenomenology from 2015, Real Hallucinations, Psychiatric Illness, Intentionality, and the Interpersonal World from 2017, and most recently, Grief Worlds, a Study of Emotional Experience from 2023. He's also written dozens of articles among many other distinguished professional activities. He received his PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge in 1999 and has since taught at University College Cork, Durham University, and the University of Vienna. In particular, Ratcliffe has been a pioneer in work at the intersection of philosophy and psychiatry, including health, mood, and the emotion, so you can understand why he was immediately someone who came to mind as a dream keynote for us for this conference. For Ratcliffe, emotions and moods are not localized inner experiences that express either normalcy or pathology in the way that we tend to think about it, but rather are bound up with our ways of being in the world and our practices of meaning-making, broadly speaking. His work on existential feelings has been particularly influential in phenomenology. He argues that existential feelings are a distinct category of feelings apart from emotional feelings, in the sense that they're not directed at specific objects or situations, but are background orientations through which experience as a whole is structured. Throughout this work, and his work on related phenomena, such as schizophrenia, depression, grief, empathy, bodily feelings, delusions, diagnoses, and truly so much more, Ratcliffe contends that phenomenology offers important insights into the nature of experience in its diverse manifestations. This provides a corrective, I would say, to phenomenology's tendency to consider pathological phenomena as limit cases or exceptions to the rule. It has also opened up entire new areas of inquiry into the phenomenology of affective life. For Ratcliffe, understanding the world-disclosive features of pathological phenomena is an important corollary to medical and psychiatric perspectives. Throughout his work, he blends analysis rooted in the deep tradition of classical phenomenology and existential phenomenology with careful readings of case studies, literature, and more to advance original and productive accounts of our affective lives. I should also add that he is a beautiful writer whose works are a real pleasure to read, so I'm grateful to him for that. We're honored to have him here with us today to deliver his presentation, The Phenomenology of Disorientation. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction, and thanks also to you and Ali and your colleagues for inviting me and for all the work you've put into this event and making everyone feel so welcome. And thanks to all of you for sticking around at the end of the day. That first slide, I'm not going to talk about airports. It's just that over the last 3 years I've had so many horrendous airport experiences that it seemed fitting for a talk on disorientation. A nod to that, but no more. So, as you can see from the title, what I'd like to do today is just offer a few thoughts on what it is to experience disorientation. And as you may have noticed, this is a theme that's actually cropped up several times in the conference already. It's been mentioned in quite a few talks. So let me give you some context for this, first of all. So over several years, things I've worked on include the phenomenology of depression, schizophrenia, trauma, grief, loneliness, and loss. And in all of these cases, talk of disorientation crops up repeatedly in first-person accounts from a variety of sources. And talk of disorientation also relates very closely to a number of other phenomena that I've been looking at, including trust, hope, the sense of possibility, certainty, reality, belonging, home, and interpersonal connection. Indeed, I've gradually come to the view that alongside a sense of estrangement or isolation from other people, disorientation is perhaps the central theme of first-person accounts of the experiences associated with a number of psychiatric diagnoses. But of course, it's not exclusive to mental health conditions. We find experiences of disorientation described much more widely. And indeed, disorientation, when you look at the state of the world, is a good candidate for the mood of our time, if indeed it is a mood, which remains to be seen. So given all of this, I thought I should probably try and figure out exactly what it is. And also I found I've been using the term myself without thinking much about it, talking about existential orientations and evaluative orientations, and then found out that people who were engaging with it more seriously were quoting that. So I thought I really need to try and figure this out. Now, when you start looking at this phenomenon, you see straight away that disorientation spans a range of situations. And a variety of different experiences. So disorientations vary markedly in their focus, their breadth, and their depth or their profundity. It can be an individual or collective phenomenon. It can be short-lived, something that crops up repeatedly, something that's enduring. Thematically, it varies hugely. It might be a matter of how one relates to surrounding space, time, geographical location, other people, home, society, culture, one's autobiography, shared history, the ethical, the political. So the reach of disorientation is quite vast. And not all talk of disorientation can be understood in terms of experience, but my focus is going to be specifically on what it is to feel disorientated across this wide variety of situations. So what do disorientation experiences consist of, and what might they have in common? Well, you might just flap up your hands and say, oh, daft question, look at it, it's so diverse, they share very little in common, let's move on, please. But I'm going to suggest that there's a unity to disorientation, and the case for that's pretty simple, which is that it's derived from the unity of orientation. Now, some disorientation experiences are primarily spatial in nature. And if you look at work in psychology on disorientation, you might think that that's all that it is. But people also talk of feeling disorientated in circumstances such as serious injury, chronic illness, protracted upheaval due to the loss of a home or a relationship or a career. And as I've also found, disorientation is a recurrent theme in first-person accounts of bereavement. So I'll just give you one example. So reflecting on her own experience, the neurologist Lisa Schulman writes that bereavement involves finding oneself in an unfamiliar world, a world where the rules are all scrambled. And she says, I think quite rightly, that it's therefore wrong to portray grief primarily in terms of deep sorrow. More predominant themes for many people are disorientation, loss of self, loss of identity. And this kind of disorientation may be a more conspicuous feature of grief at different times because, of course, grief varies enormously over time and also between people. And disorientation in grief has been addressed by philosophers. Amy Harbin, for example, in her book on disorientation, emphasizes being unable to go on, being unable to continue. And in a recent paper, Memel in Phenomenology in the Cognitive Sciences proposes that, more specifically, that bereavement involves losing life possibilities, the possibilities required to pursue and become a certain future self. And his analysis is explicitly Heideggerian. But disorientation of this nature certainly isn't specific to bereavement. Losing the structure or organization of one's life, finding oneself unable to go on in certain ways, losing a certain sense of self or identity. These are also prominent themes in many, many first-person accounts of serious illness and injury, especially in the aftermath of sudden events. People talk of being profoundly disorientated. So here's how, I'm going to keep peering up there just to check that the right slide's up on the screen. But here's how the author Hanif Qureshi describes the life-changing effects of injury due to a fall. He writes, 2 weeks ago, a bomb went off in my life, which has also shattered the lives of those around me, my partner, children, friends. All of my relationships are being renegotiated. And his account also includes talk of being uprooted, becoming unfamiliar to oneself, undergoing a process of change, self-change. He writes, I have no home now, no centre. I'm a stranger to myself. I don't know who I am anymore. Someone new is emerging. And other accounts similarly describe an all-enveloping, dynamic and temporally extended disturbance of one's life, which is also described in terms of identity or self. One's goals, expectations, projects, habits, relationships, pastimes and values, this whole tapestry that may have been taken for granted and served as a sort of lens through which one experienced and engaged with the world, all of this is disrupted. So Paul Kalanithi, a medical doctor who was himself diagnosed with a fatal brain tumour, describes severe illness as life-shattering. It left him lost and confused, as though, he says, someone had firebombed the path forward. His imagined future, his personal identity, both collapsed. And in English language accounts, at least, you find time and time again reference to shattering, being broken, shattered, splintered, fragmented, with a range of other metaphors, having the rug pulled out from under one's feet, being left reeling or spinning, losing one's balance, footing, or way. And even though I've quoted from accounts by professional authors, this kind of talk is much more widespread, and you'll find it from a wide variety of sources. So there's obviously the concern that disorientation encompasses diverse phenomena, undermining any attempts to generalize. And philosophers have addressed disunity in different ways. So Amy Harbin suggests that the common theme is being unable to go on. But there are all sorts of different experiences of being unable to go on, and there's no singular common theme that we can point to. Rather, she says, drawing on Wittgenstein, it's a family resemblance concept. It's all sorts of overlapping things, spanning a spectrum, she writes, of widely varying experiences that in all cases disrupt everyday ways of acting and being. So that's one account. It's a family resemblance concept. We shouldn't look for any unity. We can explore these phenomena in relative isolation from one another. Now, Mermel and also someone called Cabanas in a recent paper adopt a different approach. They suggest that spatial disorientation is literal and that other talk of disorientation is metaphorical. So when we talk about political disorientation, moral disorientation, the disorientation of grief, it's a metaphor that's drawing on this literal spatial sense. And Pablo Fernandez Velasco, until very recently a postdoc of mine, has also done some very, very good work on this topic. And the approach that he and his colleagues take is not to regard non-spatial uses as metaphorical, but rather to say, okay, let's just adopt a method where we start from the spatial or the prototypical, work that out and sort of build up from there. And they also indicate that spatial orientation has a kind of neurobiological primacy and that other forms of orientation develop from this. So those are some of the things philosophers have tried to do. But I think it's plausible to maintain that the seeming diversity of disorientation stems from an underlying unity. All disorientations are disturbances of something that itself has a phenomenological structure, orientation. And although orientation spans all aspects of our experience, our thought, our practice, our engagement with the world, it is essentially singular. Indeed, to have two or more distinct orientations would be, by definition, to be disoriented. Indeed, we talk about disorientation a lot of the time as the unsettling of something that was already in place. And you might worry that just because we experience disorientation, that doesn't mean we experience orientation. Remember Wittgenstein on unfamiliarity feelings. Doesn't mean there's a feeling of familiarity, first of all. But in the case of orientation, I think there is. And the pervasiveness of orientation talk is a clue to its nature. And in a detailed and insightful study that I think has received less recognition than it deserves, Werner Stegmaier shows how almost everything that we experience, think, say and do can be couched in terms of orientation, as can our relations with individuals and collectives. Trust and respect, he says, are orienting. Interpersonal encounters orient and disorientate us. We orient to others' orientations. And even the idea of God, he says, is a response to the uncertainty of orientation. You can't get away from it. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute. Overly permissive use of the term orientation just risks making it unhelpful, uninformative. It's a linguistic window dressing that you can just plop onto anything you want. But Stegmaier maintains otherwise. He says that orientation is indeed all-pervasive in our experience. And furthermore, it's primitive, it's unanalysable. It's so fundamental to our lives that we only kind of notice it when it no longer works. And I think he's right about all this. And I think we can demonstrate the ubiquity of orientation and also, importantly, its singularity by actually starting from the spatial and showing how it's unavoidably, phenomenologically inseparable from all the others. So let's have a go at this. Now, spatial orientation isn't just a matter of knowing how to go on or being able to go on. It has a more complicated structure, I think, and that structure involves a number of inextricable aspects. So first of all, having a sense of one's relationship to surrounding space, up, down, left, right. And then something slightly different from that, knowing one's location relative to other entities in the immediate environment. But there's also knowing where one came from and how one arrived at a certain location. You know, just drop me in here out of the blue and wake me up. I might have a sense of up, down, left, right, and maybe I've been here before and I even recognise the room, but I'm going, what the heck's happened? So where you've come from, how you've got there. And obviously knowing where you're heading and how to get there. I think it's also important to add being able to sustain 1 to 4 on this list in the event of various disruptions. Orientation is dynamically maintained. It's not complete smoothness. It never is. All these little things happen where things don't go quite to plan and you have to adjust to them. So orientation involves being able to sustain one's path in the face of disruptions one encounters. But I also want to suggest that it essentially involves knowing why one is heading in a certain direction, why it matters, what's at stake, and how it fits into a larger pattern of activities involving other directions and destinations. And then, in the absence of the 6 themes I've just listed, it involves having a sense that there is, will be, or could be somewhere appropriate to go, somewhere that remains discoverable. And in the absence of that, it's important to have a sense that perhaps with guidance from others, we'll be able to re-establish the ability to identify appropriate directions. Now, I want to suggest that these aspects of orientation are phenomenologically interdependent, together comprising a cohesive, singular sense of our being practically situated within situations that matter to us. And I think it's the inclusion of 6 to 8 that really push us to the unity and singularity of orientation. And also we'll see that 6 to 8 are most relevant to considering disorientation in the context of mental health. But hang on, you might say, this sounds a bit dodgy. Why couldn't you just instead say, shut up, Ratcliffe, spatial orientation is limited to 1 to 5, and you're pushing your luck. There's no reason to include these conditions. So you could try and block me there. But if we're talking about the phenomenology, I think we have to, and let me explain why. So I don't usually talk about Heidegger these days, but I'm going to, just briefly. I think we can do this pretty easily by turning to Heidegger's very well-known remarks about the spatiality of our dealings with equipment. So in these very well-known and over-discussed passages in the Division 1 of Sign on Sight. Heidegger emphasizes that for the most part we don't experience and engage with the world as detached observers looking upon objects that we then think about and act upon. Rather, we're purposively immersed in our surroundings and we engage in items of equipment in a way that doesn't really differentiate us fully from our surroundings. But the important point for current purposes is that we encounter things as significant and as mattering to us in various ways. And these ways of mattering are holistically organized to relate to one another. It's fairly easy to illustrate. Look at this room, look at the tables, the camera, the laptops and things, the screen. All of this comprises a functional whole in which we're immersed, and all of it makes sense together. And Heidegger suggests that the phenomenology of spatiality, of distance, of proximity, is dependent upon this. It's not a matter of Euclidean geometry. So, as you can see there, he writes how the spatiality of equipment, its closeness to us or its distance, are a matter of salience and accessibility in the context of our dealings, how things fit together, how one thing points to another, how something is reachable with various other bits of equipment we've got, how you might operate it, manipulate it. It's not physical distance, there's something else going on here. So, and every entity that's to handen, he says, has a different kind of closeness, and it's not a matter of measuring distances. And all of this depends on the place of things within a totality. Now, Heidegger's analysis is actually horrifically underdeveloped. And Jeff Malpass in Place and Experience makes this point and offers a sophisticated analysis of how the experience of place is actually prior to the experience of space. And I think there's some plausibility to that. And certainly when we turn to Heidegger, the very least we need to do is distinguish our own sense of place, the place of Dasein as an opening onto the world, our situatedness in the world, from the place of bits of equipment that we encounter. But I don't think we need to go into more detail for current purposes. What really matters is just this. Our pre-reflective experience of entities in the surrounding environment includes some sense of how they're significant or matter to us, and they matter to us in all sorts of different ways. And how things matter is inseparable from our sense of how surrounding space is organized and how we relate to that organization. And it can be added that we shouldn't think of this in too restrictive a way as a matter of using tools in the context of various goal-directed projects. Not everything we do takes that form. Not all of our experience of the world is like that. Later we might take in a beautiful sunset. We might walk through the woods and enjoy the scenery. We do things like visit museums and are drawn to artifacts out of curiosity rather than being able to use them to whack nails in a wall. And of course other people in the surrounding environment offer a host of distinctive possibilities. They're significant in distinctively personal ways, offering connection, solidarity, support, or in contrast, shame and humiliation. Nevertheless, I think Heidegger's observations concerning the spatiality of equipment do apply more generally. We find ourselves situated within a practically organized space where relative location and distance depend on how things are integrated into larger networks of possibilities. And importantly, these possibilities reflect our various projects and wider concerns. So, being spatially oriented then involves relating in a coherent, consistent way to a largely integrated, significant whole where things have their place. If you're with me that far, I think the 3 points that follow are pretty much unavoidable. Spatial orientation is inseparable from other forms of orientation. Orientation is ubiquitous in our experience, and it's essentially singular. So, how a current situation matters to us, and with this how our space is organised, almost always implies a much larger context extending far beyond that situation. Now, when I go to Newark Liberty Airport tomorrow, recognising the potential significance of hopefully a British Airways plane sitting in the airport outside the departure gate requires an appreciation of its potential to reach a faraway destination. It implies a longer term, an understanding of its longer term significance in my life. And the significance of my immediate surroundings can also relate to events in the recent or distant past and to anticipated events in a long-term future. So, the significance of a current object of experience depends on its place not just within a situation that I'm open to now, but a much larger, temporally extended whole. And that whole reflects our goal-directed projects, enduring values, relationships, habitual expectations, and pastimes. If you like, the structure of our life is reflected in the significance of the surrounding world. There's a wonderful passage in Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness when he says, the world is a giant skeletal outline of my possible actions. And this is what he means, that the way we experience the surrounding environment with immediacy, pre-reflectively, it's like a mirror of the organisation or disorganisation of our lives. Not just goal-directed projects that knit together, but relationships, longer-term commitments, values that don't take the form of purposive projects, pastimes, expectations, habits. All of this operates as a kind of orienting structure. So you can see then that spatial orientation isn't something that can be separated from the much larger structure of our life. Hang on though, someone might object. Look, what you've shown, if anything, is just a unidirectional dependence. Sure, if the entire organisation of someone's life breaks down, they're going to experience a form of spatial disorientation. But spatial disorientation can still have primacy, because one can experience that without anything else going wrong. We can just be spatially disoriented in the way that lots of psychologists are interested. So you can have a purified, circumscribed, spatial disorientation experience. And I don't think we can. So let me give you an example. So that's a ride at the Prater theme park in Vienna called the Black Mamba. And it's quite distinctive because it has 3 different rotating axes, so it's able to hurl riders in completely unpredictable ways at high speeds. And so after spending far too long drinking beer on a campus bar with a visiting speaker, we thought it would be a good idea to go to the Prater to end the evening, and we unthinkingly and confidently just handed over €4 each, sauntered onto the Black Mamba, and what followed he described as the most distressing and terrifying experience of his life. But at one point we found ourselves right at the top, and it just stops for a while, leaves you at the top. And I looked up and saw the ground and thought, that's weird, that's where the sky should be, and vice versa. And I've never had that experience before. So it's quite clear that I was suffering from spatial disorientation. I couldn't tell the difference between up and down. So do we take this to be a purely spatial form of experience? I don't think so. And I retained a larger sense of my geographical location. I was in the Prater, in Vienna, about 2 miles from where I lived at the time. Furthermore, I retained a sense that when I disembarked, I'd be able to stagger off, walk down the Prater Hauptallee to Praterstern, board the U2 Schottentor and get the Straßenbahn home. My wider sense of where I was and how to get where I was going remained. And it's not just that that was there and I sort of had this separate experience. Rather, the experience itself was contained and mitigated by this larger sense of orientation that remained intact. At the time, I experienced it as only this, nothing more. I don't think the visiting speaker did, but in my case at least, it wasn't a source of anxiety or helplessness, but more of inebriated curiosity, a circumscribed, transient disturbance of a larger orientation that remained intact, which was experienced as precisely that. If you like, even while on the Black Mamba going, down, I continue to find myself in the world in a certain way. Now, Pablo, again, notes that spatial disorientation often, but not always, incorporates feelings of anxiety, vulnerability, and helplessness, confusion, perplexity, and diminishment or isolation. But whether or not we have such feelings depends on how the disorientation itself matters to us. And this is something that depends in part on whether its experience is arising against a larger backdrop of orientation or disorientation. My experience would have been quite different had I also lacked a clear sense of location and place, had the organisation of my life been profoundly disrupted at the time, were I not confident of when or how the ride would end. Had I not trusted the ride operator? I also think, and I only go through this briefly, the case against purely spatial disorientation can be further supported by asking what a purely spatial experience of orientation would look like. Just spatial, nothing more. And if anything, I think it would resemble certain forms of experience that are described in the context of psychopathology on occasion. So, take this passage from the memoir autobiography of a schizophrenic girl. The author, known only as Renee, describes this experience of space bereft of place and boundary, an immense space without boundary, limitless, flat, a mineral lunar country cold as the wastes of the North Pole. In this stretching emptiness, all is unchangeable, immobile, congealed, crystallized. Objects are stage trappings here and there, geometric cubes without meaning. It's perfectly compatible with knowing up and down and your relative location compared to other objects, but it's a profoundly disorienting experience of space. And once we accept all of this, I think we get the unity of orientation. So, the organisation of our life doesn't come from nowhere. It's embedded, it depends on the idiosyncratic ways in which we take up all sorts of shared practices, narratives, norms, social roles and things like that. So insofar as surrounding space reflects the idiosyncratic organisation of one's life, projects, plans, habits, expectations, sense of what's important, it's also an interpersonal, social, cultural, political and ethical space. And so I think this just lets everything through the door in short. I won't go into more detail, but I think we kind of got to where we need. If you did have a political orientation wholly different from your projects, orientation towards other people totally separate from your sense of significant space, that would be disorientation. That's what I want to claim anyway. Now, what I've said so far might serve to illustrate the singularity and unity of orientation if you've believed me, but it's really incomplete. And that's because I think there's sometimes a tendency to think of orientation as having structure. My life is like this crystal clear tapestry that maps onto the world in crystal clear ways. I don't think orientation's like that at all. There's another side to this that's really important to acknowledge. Orientation further requires a distinctive, diffuse attitude, if you like, towards whatever structure we have. And importantly, towards the incompleteness of that structure. It's irrevocably incomplete. And I won't say any more about this now, but I think this relates very closely to what Harvey Carell calls bodily doubt. The opposite of doubt isn't certainty and having something utterly specific, laid out, concrete, irrevocable. The opposite of bodily doubt is trust. And trust is an attitude that we adopt in contexts of uncertainty. Our lives are riddled with uncertainty, with unpredictability, with patches of indeterminacy. And being oriented, as Stegmaier actually acknowledges as well, involves a certain attitude towards that. Granted, often we do have detailed, specific information about where we are and where we're heading. But nevertheless, sustaining an orientation is just as compatible with having only a few cues to rely upon, which point to the next step, which points to the next step, and so on. So it's dynamically structured. Can't be reduced to a single moment. Each step promises to reveal the next. We have an attitude towards the structure that's there. We'll be able to keep going. It'll get us where we need to go. This is enough. It'll work out somehow. And I think it has to be like this. Our relationship with the surrounding world's in constant flux. There's always going to be indeterminacy, uncertainty, unpredictability. So orientation requires an attitude that involves being untroubled for the most part. Not completely untroubled, but untroubled for the most part by indeterminacies within the organisation of our lives and our worlds. And just having the sense that, when the time comes, we'll be able to navigate these situations. We'll get through it. We'll muddle along. And taking any structure we do have to be dependable and sufficient. And this involves a kind of diffuse, pre-reflective confidence or trust. And both Stegmaier and Harbin at different points draw analogies with footholds, and we can demonstrate it in this way. Imagine you're literally climbing and you can see that there are 3 footholds. The footholds don't dictate your attitude towards them. You can have 2 quite contrasting anticipatory attitudes. My God, there are only 3 footholds. This isn't enough. How am I going to do it? I don't know where these will lead to. What if it's a dead end? What if I can't get back? It's impossible. Or there might be a sense of, okay, let's just get on with it and see how this goes. They can appear significant in different ways. So orientation is essentially a way, I think, of not establishing structure so much as a way of approaching the kind of structure one has, the degree of structure one has, a way of experiencing indeterminacy and uncertainty. I'll continue to have enough to draw on. It'll work out somehow. I'll get there eventually. I can keep going. I'll be able to do what's needed when the time comes. And I think we can get loads of support for this position by wallowing in Wittgenstein. So, wayfinding is a constant theme in Wittgenstein's work. You look for it, it pops up everywhere. And for Wittgenstein, knowing how to go on in some general sense isn't a matter of being able to specify exactly how we'll go on. It's more a matter of anticipating that we'll be able to do what's needed when the time comes. So, of course, in philosophical investigations, he famously considers number sequences and says, now I can go on. But his considerations are much wider ranging. More generally, he indicates that knowing how to go on, being able to go on, doesn't involve knowing exactly how the ensuing moments will unfold, or for that matter, how they ought to unfold. Rather, he says, we get off to a glad start, rather like your journey before the airline gets you. You set off buoyantly on your travels with the sense that it'll all unfold well. You set off to a glad start, and that's compatible with things going awfully wrong or you not being able to carry on in a certain way. So a glad start, it's not a matter of anticipating things precisely. It's a less determinate sense that they're unfolding and that they will unfold in a certain general way. So he gives the example of remembering a tune, where you think, I can't, oh yeah, now I know it, now I can sing it. And says, it doesn't appear to you in its entirety in an instant. Rather, it's a change in anticipatory attitude. Now you sense that you will be able to deliver this tune. It doesn't occur to me in its entirety at that moment. So expectation of this kind, and much more generally, doesn't require a determinate representation of what's coming next. As he writes in the Brown book, there's just something wrong with a way of thinking that we find in an awful lot of philosophy, that seeks to establish a spooky kind of mental act present in full at a certain time, which is capable of crossing the bridge before we've even got to it. All of this is irreducibly dynamic for Wittgenstein. And I think perhaps more than anything else, central to orientation is our being comfortable with this fact. It involves an overarching style of anticipation, a glad start that we sense will play out. And now we start to move more clearly towards the domain of mental health, and I'll round off with this shortly. We shouldn't think of this glad start just as things progressing smoothly. Now I can sing the tune, now nothing will go wrong. What if I forget these words? What if... It's also integral to this attitude is a sense that we'll be able to navigate the disruption that we will encounter. We'll get through it somehow. And I think in thinking of disorientation, we can distinguish between four broad predicaments. There are disorientations that we experience as transient, navigable, localized perturbations of orientation. The attitude remains largely intact. But then there are more profound forms of experience that we find in life upheaval, grief, other forms of loss, where the structure of one's life and world are disrupted in wide-ranging and enduring ways that we navigate over time. But we may retain a sense that there's a path through them, even though the specifics of that path remain unclear. We're disorientated, but we retain the sense we will get through it somehow. But then there are more profound forms of disorientation that involve greater departures, greater privations from orientation. A disorientation that involves being able to identify no such path, but you might retain the sense that it's discoverable. I can't see a way through this, but it'll come. And then finally, perhaps the most profound family of experiences, disorientations that involve a sense of being irrevocably lost without any prospect of establishing a destination or route. And I think the experience depth or profundity of disorientation depends not only on what you might call the magnitude of the disruption, but whether and to what extent and in what way we experience it as potentially surmountable. Shallower forms incorporate an appreciation of our disorientation as localized, short-lived, transient. But deeper forms involve a relative lack of contextualization, containment. There's a shift in our anticipatory attitude that undermines to varying degrees our sense that there could be a way to go on. And we can think of this in terms of loss of confidence or trust. We don't just lose our way, we also lose our sense that the surrounding world, including the interpersonal world, will provide the resources required for reorientation, to find a new path. Things and people no longer appear dependable, and our sense that there's a way through it falters. And sometimes we find something like this in first-person accounts of grief. These are from testimonies that I collected as part of a recent qualitative survey. So sometimes those who are grieving describe a pervasive loss of confidence or trust in the world. One's whole world is profoundly shaken in an enduring way. I felt that my world was turned upside down. As a child, I trusted it'd all be all right. And when it wasn't, when it finally wasn't, I was shattered by it. Nothing I believed in before, nothing could be trusted. Another account, it shattered my confidence in life, ever being happy again. It's touched every aspect of my life, shattered my confidence. I no longer feel I can ever be happy again. And where the emphasis is on a change in what we anticipate from other people in general. This is most often termed a loss of trust rather than confidence. Not trusting this person to do that or even trusting this person, rather a more general attitude towards other people in general, set of habitual bodily expectations involving others. So you might say that this form of basic trust involves anticipating their availability, benevolence, knowledge, their practical ability as well. And when you look at accounts of disorientation for many of us, not all of us, but many of us, much of the time, other people offer the prospect of reorientation. When we're lost, in short, they can provide guidance and support. Think of the first canto of Dante's Inferno. He finds himself lost in a dark wood, his paths blocked by wild beasts. And yet, even though he has to go through the Inferno and back out through purgatory, he has Virgil as a guide. He can't see his way through, but Virgil offers this prospect. And our sense of being able to get through it somehow is partly constituted by this enduring sense that other people will continue to offer possibilities for reorientation, including possibilities that we can't envisage. I can't find a way through it, but maybe they'll help me to find it. I can't see the path myself, but the very fact that I can relate to them in this way means there might be a path. So, when we turn to feeling irrevocably disoriented, lost with no prospect of escape. We often find that this is associated with a profound erosion of trust in other people in general. They no longer offer such possibilities. And we see this in first-person accounts of major depressive disorder quite frequently. Even though diagnostic manuals barely mention interpersonal experience, it's absolutely central in almost all cases. And for many people, the most salient, pervasive, consistent source of distress is finding oneself irrevocably adrift, lost, cut off from others in general, with no prospect of finding one's way back. And this often involves a kind of pervasive trust in others who appear hostile, cruel, or just indifferent. And it can be expressed in ways like this. This might look like a propositional evaluation, but it relates to a much more general form of experience. The world's a cold, cruel place populated by utter bastards stomping on the poor and vulnerable. No one does anything for altruistic reasons. It's been wiped out of human society, etc. And this is intimately associated with feeling lost with no way out. As others write, and again these are testimonies I collected myself, I feel lost and like all the things I've achieved don't mean anything. I withdraw from any social contact and then get lost in my own world. So I think loss of interpersonal trust is central to this sense of estrangement from a structured, practically meaningful world. And disorientation experiences then. What I want to suggest is that disorientation experiences thus involve shifts in how we experience the significance of indeterminacy, but also, crucially, the kinds of orienting resources at our disposal. When I talk about anticipation, trust, confidence, how should we construe this? Well, I think the kind of anticipation at play here is, for the most part, unreflective, practical, and bodily in nature. It's probably misleading to call disorientation an emotional experience if we think of emotions as neat things that belong to nice, familiar categories. But we can think of it as a feeling, more specifically a kind of anticipatory feeling, a general style of pre-reflective, practical anticipation. So I'll round things off there then. And just with the last couple of slides, I'll just summarise where I think I've got to, and maybe you can tell me if I haven't got to it. So we end up with a kind of perspective where orientation is not a component of experience that we can isolate and then happily bolt it onto whatever our pre-established philosophical approach might be as a little component. When we start to think of orientation and recognise its pervasiveness, we see how it actually points to a much larger conception of human experience, thought, interpersonal relations, activities. And this conception emphasises phenomenologically our precarity, our fragility, and our essentially dynamic structure. Orientation, I think, and disorientation leads us to a perspective where we see that all experience is structured by temporally extended engagement with significant possibilities involving a certain style of anticipation. And this spans where we are, how we got there, where we're going, how we'll get there, why we're going there, whether it's possible to get there, whether there's any actual or potential alternative, and whether any alternative might be discoverable. So it's very simple, but it encompasses a lot. And it's essentially a matter of how we encounter uncertainty and indeterminacy, what we experience as disruptive, and how we navigate that disruption.